Welcome, dear friends, to a heartwarming tale of unexpected twists, family secrets, and the extraordinary power of compassion. Enjoy the story. Leonard Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Industries and one of New York's most eligible bachelors, stared at his reflection in the full-length mirror of his penthouse apartment. The man looking back at him was a far cry from the polished businessman who graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, running a hand through his newly dyed and disheveled hair. The green food coloring had given it a sickly, unkempt appearance. His usually clean-shaven face was hidden behind a scraggly fake beard, and thick, ill-fitting glasses perched precariously on his nose. Leonard's designer suit had been replaced by threadbare pants that hung loosely on his frame, and a tattered jacket with one sleeve partially torn off. To complete the ensemble, he clutched a large canvas bag filled with empty bottles. As he made his way down to the busy streets of Manhattan, Leonard couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, worth billions, shuffling along the sidewalk like a common vagrant, all because of his son's harebrained scheme. "The things we do for family," he sighed, remembering the conversation from the night before. People on the street gave him a wide berth, some averting their eyes, others shooting him looks of disgust or pity. It was a stark contrast to the reverence and respect he usually commanded. "Spare some change?" he called out half-heartedly to a passerby, cringing inwardly at how foreign the words felt on his tongue. The man hurried past without a second glance, leaving Leonard standing there, feeling both ridiculous and strangely invisible. As he approached the business district, Leonard's eyes were drawn to the gleaming skyscrapers that housed some of the world's most powerful corporations, including his own. He watched as men and women in sharp suits strode purposefully into the buildings, their lives a mirror of what his had been just 24 hours ago. "Focus, Len," he muttered to himself. "You're here for Daniel." With a deep breath, Leonard steeled himself and shuffled towards the parking lot of a nearby office complex. It was time to put his son's plan into action, no matter how much he disagreed with it. The late afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt of the business center parking lot as Leonard hovered uncertainly near the entrance. He'd spent the better part of an hour watching people come and go, trying to work up the courage to approach someone. "This is ridiculous," he thought, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm Leonard Blackwell, for crying out loud. I don't beg. I make billion-dollar deals." Just as he was about to give up and call the whole thing off, a young woman caught his eye. She was pretty in a girl-next-door kind of way, with honey blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her dress, while attractive, was clearly off the rack, a far cry from the designer labels that surrounded her. As she approached her car, a modest sedan that had seen better days, Leonard made his move. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, adopting a gravelly voice. "Could you spare some food for a hungry old man?" The woman turned, startled. For a moment, Leonard feared she'd simply ignore him like all the others. But then her expression softened. "Oh, you poor thing," she said, reaching into her bag. "I have a pizza here. I was going to have it for dinner, but you need it more than I do." Leonard was taken aback by her kindness. As he reached for the offered food, the woman, Elizabeth, he would later learn, tilted her head thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "I might have something better than just a meal. How would you like a job?" Leonard nearly choked on his first bite of pizza. "A job?" he spluttered. Elizabeth nodded enthusiastically. "I run an animal shelter on the outskirts of town. We're always in need of help. It's not much pay, I'm afraid, but it comes with meals and a roof over your head." For a moment, Leonard was at a loss for words. This wasn't part of the plan. He was supposed to wheedle information out of her about her supposed infidelity, not get a job offer. That's very kind of you," he stammered. "Great," Elizabeth beamed. "Hop in, and I'll take you there now. We can sort out the details on the way." Before he knew what was happening, Leonard found himself in the passenger seat of Elizabeth's car, headed towards the industrial district. As they drove, he couldn't help but marvel at the young woman's compassion and initiative. Maybe Daniel was wrong about her, he thought, but there was only one way to find out for sure. The previous night, Leonard's peaceful evening had been shattered by the arrival of his son, Daniel. The young man had burst into the mansion, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled, his eyes wild with a mix of anger and hurt. "Dad, I need your help," Daniel had said without preamble. "I think Elizabeth is cheating on me." Leonard had nearly dropped his glass of scotch. "Elizabeth? You're Elizabeth, son? That doesn't sound like her at all." Daniel had paced the room like a caged animal. I know, but she's been acting so strange lately, always rushing off, being secretive about her phone. And then I saw a huge bank transfer on her statement. Where's that money going, Dad?" Leonard had tried to reason with his son. "Daniel, Elizabeth runs her own business. Surely large transfers aren't unusual." But Daniel wouldn't be swayed. He'd pulled out a duffel bag, dumping its contents on the antique Persian rug. "That's why I came up with this plan. You're going to go undercover, Dad, as a homeless man." Leonard had stared at the pile of ragged clothes and theatrical makeup in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am," Daniel had insisted. "Elizabeth has a soft spot for the less fortunate. If anyone can get her to open up, it's you in disguise. Please, Dad, I need to know the truth before I marry her." Now, as Leonard sat in Elizabeth's car, heading towards her mysterious animal shelter, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. Was he betraying this kind young woman's trust, or was he protecting his son from heartbreak? As they pulled up to a dilapidated warehouse in the industrial district, Leonard steeled himself. Whatever the truth was, he was determined to uncover it. The drive to Elizabeth's animal shelter had been enlightening, to say the least. As they wound their way through the city's outskirts, Elizabeth had chatted animatedly about her passion project. "I've always loved animals," she'd explained, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "When I realized how many strays were on the streets, I knew I had to do something. It started small, just a few rescued cats and dogs. But now—" She'd trailed off as they pulled up to a large, somewhat run-down warehouse. "Well, now it's this," she'd said with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. As Elizabeth led Leonard through the shelter, he was amazed at the scale of the operation. Rows of kennels housed dogs of all shapes and sizes, while a separate area was dedicated to cats. In another room, he spotted cages with rabbits, guinea pigs, and even a few birds. "This is impressive," Leonard had said, genuinely awed. "How do you manage all this?" Elizabeth had sighed. "It's not easy. Funds are always tight, and we're constantly short-staffed. That's why I'm so grateful you agreed to help." Leonard had felt a pang of guilt at her words. Here he was, investigating this woman under false pretenses, when all she was doing was trying to help animals in need. As they'd reached the dog kennels, Leonard's world had tilted on its axis. There, in one of the pens, was a familiar face, or rather, a familiar furry muzzle. "Daisy!" he'd gasped, forgetting for a moment his homeless persona. The white dog with the bright pink tail, a ridiculous grooming choice his mother had insisted on, had perked up at the sound of her name. She'd bounded over to the kennel door, tail wagging furiously. Elizabeth had looked at him in surprise. "You know this dog?" Leonard had realized his mistake too late. In his shock at seeing Daisy, a dog he'd believed had perished along with his mother in a tragic mudslide 6 months ago. He'd let his disguise slip. He'd stammered, trying to think of a plausible explanation. But before he could come up with anything, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside had interrupted them. Moments later, Daniel had burst through the shelter doors, a bouquet of roses in one hand and a small velvet box in the other. "Elizabeth!" he'd called out. "I'm so sorry I doubted you. Daniel had trailed off as he took in the scene before him, his fiancée standing next to a disheveled homeless man who looked suspiciously like his father. For a moment, the tableau had held, frozen in disbelief. Then, as recognition dawned on Elizabeth's face, all hell had broken loose. "Leonard!" she'd exclaimed. "What on earth is going on?" Daniel had stepped forward, his face a mask of shame. "Liz, I can explain." But Daisy, recognizing Daniel, had chosen that moment to start barking excitedly, and in the chaos that followed, as explanations were demanded and apologies stammered, the dog had somehow managed to slip out of her kennel. Before anyone could stop her, Daisy had darted out of the shelter and into the fading afternoon light, her pink tail a beacon as she ran towards the nearby river. "Daisy!" Elizabeth had cried out in alarm. And just like that, their confrontation had been put on hold as all three of them, the millionaire in disguise, his contrite son, and the bewildered shelter owner, had taken off after the runaway dog. As Leonard, Daniel, and Elizabeth chased after Daisy, the absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on any of them. Here they were, a CEO disguised as a homeless man, his son clutching an engagement ring, and a young woman who ran an animal shelter, all running after a dog with a pink tail. "Daisy!" Elizabeth called out, her voice tinged with worry. "Come back, girl." The dog, however, seemed to have a specific destination in mind. She led them on a merry chase through overgrown paths along the riverbank, her white fur standing out against the deepening twilight. Finally, Daisy came to a stop in front of a ramshackle structure that could barely be called a shack. It was little more than a lean-to made of scavenged wood and corrugated metal, hidden from view by a weeping willow. As they approached, Leonard felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. There was something familiar about this place, something that tugged at the edges of his memory. Daisy scratched at the door of the shack, whining softly. Elizabeth moved to open it, but Leonard held out a hand to stop her. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I think I know who might be in there." Daniel looked at his father in confusion. "Dad, what are you talking about?" But Leonard was already moving forward, his heart pounding in his chest. With a trembling hand, he pushed open the makeshift door. The interior of the shack was dark, lit only by the fading daylight filtering through cracks in the walls. As their eyes adjusted, they made out a figure lying on a threadbare mattress in the corner. "Oh my God!" Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. There, on the mattress, lay an elderly woman. Her silver hair was matted and unkempt, her clothes little more than rags. But despite her disheveled appearance, there was no mistaking her identity. "Grandma Anna?" Daniel whispered in disbelief. The woman stirred at the sound of voices, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment she stared at them in confusion. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, recognition flooded her face. "Leonard? Daniel?" she croaked, her voice weak but unmistakable. "Is it really you?" As Daisy bounded over to the bed, tail wagging furiously, the full weight of the situation crashed down on them. Anna Blackwell, Daniel's grandmother and Leonard's mother, was alive. The woman they had mourned for 6 months, believed lost in a devastating mudslide, was here in front of them, living in squalor by the river. Questions whirled through Leonard's mind. How had she survived? Why hadn't she come home? And who had been caring for her all this time? As if in answer to his unspoken questions, the sound of footsteps outside the shack made them all turn. A man stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of shock and fear as he took in the scene before him. "Greg?" Anna said, a note of affection in her voice. "Greg, look who's here. It's my family." The newcomer, Greg, seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I guess," he said softly, "it's time for me to explain everything." And as the group settled in to hear Greg's story, Leonard couldn't help but feel that they were on the cusp of unraveling a mystery that would change all their lives forever. The interior of the shack felt cramped with all of them inside, but nobody seemed inclined to leave. Greg, a man who looked to be in his late 60s with weathered features and kind eyes, sat on an overturned crate, his gaze fixed on Anna. "I suppose I should start at the beginning," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Anna and we have a history." Anna reached out and took Greg's hand, smiling encouragingly. "It's okay, dear. They should know the truth." Greg nodded, took a deep breath, and began his tale. "Anna and I met in college almost 50 years ago. We fell in love, but her mother, well, she didn't approve of me. Said I wasn't good enough for her daughter." Leonard and Daniel exchanged glances. They'd never heard this part of Anna's past before. Greg continued, "We were forced apart. Anna married someone else, had a family. I tried to move on, but I never really did." He paused, his eyes misting over with memories. "Life has a funny way of giving second chances, though. 6 months ago, I was living down here by the river, lost my job, then my house. Thought things couldn't get any worse. His voice grew urgent as he recounted the night of the mudslide. I heard the rumble, saw the hillside coming down, and there, in the middle of it all, was Anna. I didn't even think. I just ran and pulled her out. Anna squeezed his hand. My hero, she said softly. But when she came to, Greg said, his voice heavy with guilt, she didn't remember anything. Not her name, not her family. Nothing. Understanding dawned on Leonard's face. So you told her? Greg nodded, shame evident in his expression. I told her we were married, that we lived here together. I know it was wrong, but after all these years, to have her back, I couldn't bear to lose her again. The shack fell silent as everyone absorbed this revelation. Elizabeth, who had been quietly listening, was the first to speak. But why didn't you seek help? Surely you could see she needed medical attention. Greg's face crumpled. I was sick myself, he admitted. Cancer. Used up all my savings on treatments that didn't work. I thought I only had a few months left. I wanted to spend them with Anna, even if she didn't really remember me. Anna turned to her family, her eyes clear and alert. But I do remember now, she said. Seeing all of you, it brought it all back. And Greg, she turned back to him, her gaze soft. I remember you too. Not just from these past months, but from before. You were my first love. The revelation hung in the air, heavy with decades of unspoken emotions. Leonard cleared his throat, struggling to process everything he'd heard. Mom, he said gently, we thought you were dead. We mourned you. Why didn't you try to contact us once you regained your memory? Anna's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Leonard, by the time I started remembering, Greg was so ill. I couldn't bear to leave him, and I was ashamed. Ashamed that I had forgotten you all. Ashamed that I had lived this life while you grieved. It seemed easier to stay hidden. Daniel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. Grandma, none of that matters now. We're just so happy you're alive. He turned to Greg, his expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. And you, sir, you saved my grandmother's life. We owe you a debt we can never repay. Greg shook his head, coughing slightly. I don't deserve your thanks. I lied to Anna, kept her from her family. Out of love, Elizabeth interjected, surprising everyone. She had been standing quietly in the corner, taking everything in. Now she stepped forward, her eyes shining with compassion. You did it out of love. It may not have been right, but it's understandable. Leonard looked at his future daughter-in-law with newfound respect. Here was the woman his son had suspected of infidelity, showing more understanding and forgiveness than any of them. Suddenly, Anna started coughing violently, her frail body shaking with the effort. Greg moved to her side instantly, his own illness forgotten in his concern for her. We need to get you both to a hospital, Leonard said decisively, slipping back into his role as the family's problem solver. No arguments. You both need medical attention, and we have a lot of catching up to do, but we'll do it somewhere comfortable and safe. As they helped Anna and Greg out of the shack, with Daisy trotting happily beside them, Leonard couldn't help but marvel at the strange twists of fate that had brought them all together. His ridiculous masquerade as a homeless man, Daniel's misguided suspicions, Elizabeth's compassionate heart, all of it had led to this moment of reunion and redemption. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Anna and Greg were admitted to the best private hospital in the city, courtesy of Leonard's considerable influence and resources. As they underwent treatment, Anna for severe pneumonia and malnutrition, Greg for his advanced cancer, the Blackwell family began the process of healing their emotional wounds. Daniel and Elizabeth spent hours by Anna's bedside, filling her in on everything she had missed. They told her about their engagement, about Elizabeth's animal shelter, and about the misunderstanding that had led to Leonard's undercover mission. I still can't believe you thought I was cheating on you, Elizabeth said to Daniel one afternoon, shaking her head in disbelief. And with a secret lover, I was supposedly keeping in an animal shelter, no less. Daniel had the grace to look sheepish. I know, it was stupid of me. Can you ever forgive me? Elizabeth's expression softened. I already have. But you owe your dad a huge apology for making him dress up like a homeless person. From his chair on the other side of the room, Leonard chuckled. Oh, I don't know. It was actually quite illuminating. Gave me a new perspective on things. And indeed it had. The experience of being treated as invisible, of being on the receiving end of both cruelty and unexpected kindness, had profoundly affected Leonard. He found himself reevaluating his priorities, both in business and in his personal life. One outcome of this soul-searching was a renewed commitment to philanthropy. Leonard threw himself into supporting Elizabeth's animal shelter, using his business acumen and connections to secure funding and expand its operations. You know, he said to Elizabeth one day as they toured the newly renovated facility, I think I owe you an apology too. I went along with Daniel's plan, even though I knew it was wrong. I should have trusted my instincts about you. Elizabeth smiled, reaching out to scratch behind Daisy's ears as the dog trotted alongside them. Water under the bridge, Leonard. Besides, if you hadn't come here in disguise, who knows how long it would have taken to find Anna and Greg. The mention of Greg sobered them both. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, his cancer had progressed too far. The doctors gave him only a few months to live. But those months, as it turned out, were filled with more joy than Greg had ever thought possible. Anna, once she had regained her strength, rarely left his side. They spent their days talking, laughing, and making up for lost time. You know, Anna said to Leonard one evening, as they watched Greg dozing in his hospital bed, I loved your father very much. But Greg was the love of my life. I just didn't have the courage to fight for him when I was young. Leonard squeezed his mother-in-law's hand. And now? Anna's eyes sparkled with determination. Now I'm not letting him go. Not ever again. As summer faded into autumn, the Blackwell family found themselves planning not one wedding, but two. Daniel and Elizabeth's nuptials had been postponed in light of recent events, and now Anna had announced her intention to marry Greg. Are you sure about this, Mom? Leonard asked gently. You know that Greg doesn't have much time left. Anna's response was immediate and firm. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Leonard. I lost 50 years with Greg because I was too afraid to follow my heart. I won't waste another day. And so, on a crisp October afternoon, the grand ballroom of the Blackwell mansion played host to a double wedding. Elizabeth was radiant in a simple but elegant gown, her bridesmaids a mix of childhood friends and volunteers from the animal shelter. Daniel beamed with pride and love as he watched her walk down the aisle. But it was the second couple that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Greg, frail but determined, stood tall as he waited for his bride, and Anna, her silver hair crowned with a wreath of autumn flowers, practically glowed with happiness as she took her place beside him. As the minister pronounced both couples husband and wife, a joyous bark echoed through the ballroom. Daisy, resplendent in a floral collar, had broken free from her handler and was bounding down the aisle, her pink tail wagging furiously. Laughter filled the room as the little dog jumped up to plant slobbery kisses on both brides. It was a moment of pure, unbridled joy, a perfect symbol of the love and second chances that had brought them all together. At the reception that followed, Leonard found himself standing alone for a moment, taking in the scene before him. Daniel and Elizabeth were dancing, lost in each other's eyes. Anna and Greg sat hand in hand, surrounded by well-wishers, and weaving through the crowd, accepting pets and treats from delighted guests, was Daisy. Quite a gathering, isn't it? Leonard turned to find a striking woman in her early 40s standing beside him. She had warm brown eyes and a smile that immediately put him at ease. Sarah Jenkins, she introduced herself, extending a hand. I'm the veterinarian who's been working with Elizabeth at the shelter. You must be the famous Leonard Blackwell. As they shook hands, Leonard felt an unexpected spark of connection. Famous? I don't know about that, he chuckled. Although I did have a brief career as a homeless man recently. Didn't quite make the headlines, though. Sarah's eyebrows shot up in amusement. Now that sounds like a story worth hearing. And as Leonard launched into the tale of his misadventures, he realized that perhaps his own second chance at love wasn't as far off as he'd thought. 1 year later, the Blackwell mansion was once again filled with laughter and celebration. This time, it was for the grand opening of the Anna and Greg Blackwell Animal Sanctuary, a state-of-the-art facility that combined Elizabeth's passion for animal welfare with Leonard's business acumen. Greg, defying all medical predictions, had lived to see his and Anna's first wedding anniversary. Though still frail, the joy of the past year had given him a new lease on life. He sat in a wheelchair beside Anna, beaming with pride as Elizabeth cut the ribbon to officially open the sanctuary. Daniel, now a devoted convert to the cause of animal rescue, stood on Elizabeth's other side. Their own big news. Elizabeth's pregnancy had been announced just a week earlier, adding to the family's joy. And Leonard? He found himself stealing glances at Sarah throughout the ceremony. Their friendship had blossomed over the past year into something deeper, something that filled him with a renewed sense of purpose and happiness. As the guests milled about, touring the new facilities and cooing over the animals, Daisy trotted up to Leonard. Her pink tail, now faded but still distinctive, wagged as she dropped a tennis ball at his feet. Leonard crouched down to pet her, marveling at the chain of events this little dog had set in motion. From a chance encounter in an animal shelter to a family reunited, from broken hearts mended to new love found, all because of a scruffy white dog with a pink tail. "You know," Sarah said, coming to stand beside him, "I think Daisy here deserves a special title. How about Chief Matchmaker of the Sanctuary?" Leonard laughed, standing up to wrap an arm around Sarah's waist. "I think that's perfect. After all, she brought all of us together in her own way." As they walked together to join the rest of the family, Leonard reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From a misguided masquerade to a beautiful reality, from suspicion to trust, from loss to love. It had been a year of transformation for all of them. And as he looked around at the happy faces of his family, at the contentment in Anna and Greg's eyes, at the passion and purpose radiating from Daniel and Elizabeth, and at the warmth of Sarah beside him, Leonard knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the greatest riches in life come disguised in the most unexpected packages.